Hi, my dear listeners. I'm Lady Novelist, and tonight I welcome you to another chilling episode on my YouTube channel. Have you ever been home alone and felt that creeping sensation that you're not as alone as you think? That the darkness outside might be watching? That someone might be lurking just beyond your sight? I read all my stories by myself without using artificial intelligence, so you have to take me as I am with my Eastern European accent, which I am proud of. Tonight I bring you 3 terrifying tales of being alone when danger comes knocking. These are stories of eerie figures, whispered voices, and things that defy explanation. So dim the lights, settle in and prepare yourself, because in these stories, being home alone is only the beginning of the nightmare. It was only after years had passed that I could tell this story without my hands shaking. Even now, when I think back to that night, I feel a deep sinking unease in my stomach. I was 17, and for the first time in my life, I was finally getting what I always wanted. A night alone in the house. My parents were away on a business trip, and though I had invited my friends over, none of them could make it. I had shrugged it off. One night alone wouldn't kill me. Or so I thought. Our villa was an architectural marvel, a vast glass-walled beauty overlooking the lake, set apart from the town by winding roads and dense clusters of trees. It was the kind of house that made you feel invincible, with its high-tech security and sweeping views. But that night, as I lay curled on the couch binge-watching my favorite series, I started to feel the isolation in a way I hadn't before. The silence beyond the TV's glow was thick, almost oppressive. At around 11 p.m., I decided to call it a night. I turned off the TV, climbed the stairs to my bedroom, and let the stillness of the house settle over me. I wasn't scared. At least not yet. I checked my phone one last time, locked my bedroom door for good measure, and drifted into a light, dreamless sleep. Then, sometime past midnight, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. The air was still, the house unchanged. But then I heard it. Soft footsteps outside. The sound was faint, hesitant, a slow crunch of gravel under measured steps. My breath caught in my throat. I sat up in bed, heart hammering, and strained to hear. Another step, then another. The footsteps weren't retreating, they were getting closer. My body turned ice cold as I realized that there were 2 sets of footsteps, moving in tandem. I slipped from my bed, my feet silent against the floor, and tiptoed toward the window. My hand trembled as I reached for the curtain, peeling it back just enough to see outside. 2 men. They were moving strangely, their bodies low, their heads tilting at odd angles as if they were scanning the house, searching. The porch light cast long shadows over them, distorting their movements into something unnatural. One of them walked with an almost deliberate slowness, his steps exaggerated as if he was savoring the moment. The other moved in sharp, jerking motions, stopping suddenly before resuming his unnerving prowl. Then one of them spoke. "She's home alone tonight." The words were calm, almost conversational, but they might as well have been a gunshot in my ears. My breath stopped. My fingers gripped the curtain so hard they ached. They knew I was alone. Panic surged through me like ice water. I dropped the curtain and stumbled back from the window, my mind racing. My hands fumbled for my phone on the nightstand. I barely registered the sound of them testing the doors, first the front, then the back. A metallic click echoed as one of them tried the handle. Oh God, oh God. My shaking fingers managed to press the emergency number. The dial tone barely rang before a dispatcher's voice came through. "Hello," I whispered, barely daring to breathe. "There are men outside my house. They're trying to get in." "Stay on the line with me," the dispatcher said, her voice calm and firm. "Are your doors locked?" "Yes," I breathed, "but they're still—" A loud thump reverberated through the house. They were testing the windows now. I scrambled into my closet, curling into the smallest space I could find, my phone clutched in both hands. I could hear them, low murmurs, a hushed laugh, the unmistakable sound of fingers tapping against glass. Every second stretched into an eternity. "The police are on their way," the dispatcher assured me. "Stay hidden, stay quiet." Then sirens. The wailing cut through the night like a knife. The footsteps stopped. My breath hitched. For a moment all was silent. Then, running. They bolted, their shadows flitting past the windows, disappearing into the night. A sharp knock came at the front door, followed by a booming voice. "This is the police." My legs nearly gave out as I stumbled out of the closet, my hands still trembling as I unbolted the door. A uniformed officer stood there, his flashlight cutting through the dark. "Are you okay, miss?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure I could speak. Behind him, more officers were already sweeping the property. "They're gone," he assured me, his voice steady. "We'll search the area, but you're safe now." Safe. The word felt foreign. I wasn't sure I'd ever feel truly safe again. The next morning, I learned the truth. One of the officers stayed behind, a grim expression on his face as he told me that a known rapist had escaped from prison a month ago. He had been seen in the area. The officer's words echoed in my mind. If they knew you were alone, they were watching you for a while. Watching me. I still don't know how long they had been out there before I heard them. I don't know how many times they had walked past my house, looking for a night just like that one. But I know this. I never wanted to be home alone again. I never used to be afraid of being alone, but after that night, something changed in me. I no longer trust the silence. I no longer believe that the darkness outside is empty. It happened on a cold autumn night. My husband, David, had left earlier that morning, rushing off to his parents' house 2 states away. His mother had taken a turn for the worse, and there was no question that he had to go. "I'll only be gone for a few days," he had reassured me. "Call me if you need anything." I had smiled, kissed him goodbye, and closed the door, relishing the quiet solitude of our house. I liked being alone sometimes. I told myself it would be a peaceful break, just me, a glass of wine, and a good book. But as night fell, the loneliness settled in heavier than I expected. By 11 p.m., I was curled up on the couch halfway through a crime novel when I heard it. Voices. They were faint, drifting from outside, distorted by the wind. My brows furrowed. I lived in a quiet neighborhood, and the only person nearby was my next-door neighbor, Lisa. She was a single mother of 2 little kids, and I doubted she'd be outside this late. I set my book down and went to the window. The streetlights cast pale yellow pools onto the empty road. Nothing. The voices had stopped. I turned away, telling myself I imagined it. Maybe the wind had carried them from farther down the street. Maybe someone was walking their dog. But just as I stepped away, a whisper, right outside the house. My heart lurched into my throat, the soft murmur of words, unintelligible yet deliberate. I swallowed hard and glanced toward Lisa's house. Was she outside? Maybe checking on her kids? I grabbed my jacket and stepping onto the porch. The night air was sharp and cold against my skin. The neighborhood was still, the only sound the dry rustling of leaves in the wind. "Lisa," I called out softly. Silence. I stepped further onto the lawn, glancing toward her house. Her lights were off. There was no sign of movement. I turned in a slow circle, my breath coming out in small white puffs. Then something made me look up, to the treehouse. Elisa had built it last summer for her kids. A small, sturdy wooden structure, nestled between the thick branches of an old oak tree. I had seen her children play in it countless times, their laughter echoing through the yard. But tonight there was no laughter. Tonight someone else was in there, a man. He stood in the open doorway of the treehouse, perfectly still, his body a dark silhouette against the dim interior. He was tall, his posture unnaturally rigid. His head was tilted slightly, as if studying me. My blood turned to ice. "What are you doing there?" I demanded, my voice sharp. "Who are you?" He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching. Fear crept up my spine, clawing at my ribs. My fingers twitched at my sides, itching to reach for my phone. My gut screamed at me to run. "I'm calling the police," I warned, my voice louder now, more forceful. And that's when he laughed. It was the most horrifying sound I had ever heard. High-pitched, manic, and endless. It started as a giggle, then grew into something monstrous, a jagged cackle that didn't belong to the throat of a sane man. The sound filled the night, bouncing off the trees, seeping into my bones. I turned and ran. My legs barely worked as I stumbled back inside, slamming the door and locking it. My fingers were shaking as I fumbled for my phone. I dialed 911, gasping out the words. "There's a man. He's outside. He's in my neighbor's treehouse. He won't stop laughing." "Stay inside, ma'am," the dispatcher said. "We're sending officers now." I barely heard her. The laughter hadn't stopped. It drifted through the walls, through the windows, rising and falling in unnatural waves. Then suddenly, silence. I forced myself to look outside. The treehouse was empty. The doorway, once filled with his eerie presence, gaped open like a black mouth. I gripped the phone tighter. "He's gone," I whispered. "Stay where you are, ma'am. Officers are on the way." Minutes stretched like hours. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the windows made me flinch. Then, finally, flashing red and blue lights flooded the street. I yanked the door open as two officers approached. They searched the treehouse, the yard, the street. There was no sign of him. When one of the officers returned to speak with me, his face was grim. "Ma'am, we've been looking for someone in the area tonight," he said. "A patient escaped from the local psychiatric hospital." My stomach dropped. A patient? Yes, he was committed years ago after a series of violent incidents. We don't know how long he was watching the neighborhood before you saw him. The walls seemed to close in around me. He had been watching, listening, maybe longer than I would ever know. "Keep your doors locked," the officer continued. "We have patrols searching the area. If you see or hear anything at all, call us immediately." I nodded, but I wasn't really hearing him anymore. My mind was replaying the image of that man standing in the treehouse. The way he had looked at me, the way he had laughed, the way he had disappeared. I didn't sleep that night or the next. Even when David came home, I couldn't shake the feeling that the man had never really left. That somewhere out in the dark he was still watching, waiting, and smiling. Looking back, I tell myself I was just a kid, that my mind played tricks on me, that there had to be a logical explanation for what we saw that night. But deep down, I know the truth. There are things in the dark that don't belong in our world. I was 15, staying the night at my friend Anne's house while my parents went on a rare date night. Anne's place was on the outskirts of town, just past the last few houses before the dense stretch of forest began. It was an old house, creaky and weather-worn, but cozy in that way where you felt like you could stay up all night whispering secrets under a pile of blankets. And that's exactly what we did. We watched cheesy horror movies, gossiped about the boys in our class, and stuffed ourselves with popcorn and soda until our stomachs hurt. The house was quiet, except for our giggles and the distant hum of cicadas outside. Then, sometime after midnight, we heard it. A noise outside, a rustling, a faint shuffle like someone moving carefully through the grass. Anne froze mid-sentence. Our eyes met, wild with sudden alertness. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded. We sat there listening. At first nothing. Then another sound. A slow, dragging step. Then another. It wasn't the crisp, hurried sound of a passing neighbor or someone on a late-night stroll. It was deliberate, careful. Something was sneaking around the house. Anne reached for the remote and muted the TV. The silence pressed down on us. I swallowed hard. "Maybe it's a deer," I whispered, trying to convince myself as much as her. Anne shook her head. "That doesn't sound like an animal." We crept to the window, careful not to disturb the curtains too much. The moon was full, casting an eerie silver glow over the yard. And that's when we saw him. A man. Or at least that's what we thought at first. He was hunched over near the garbage bins, wrapped in a massive, tattered jacket. His movements were jerky, unnatural, as if his limbs didn't quite work right. He sniffed at the air, then plunged his hands into one of the bins, rummaging around before pulling something out and shoving it into his mouth. I clamped a hand over my mouth to keep from gasping. The way he moved, it wasn't normal. He didn't just reach into the garbage. He dove in, his shoulders heaving as he devoured whatever scraps he found. Then slowly his head lifted. Even from across the yard, I could see his eyes gleaming in the moonlight. Not in a human way, but like an animal's, reflective, predatory. My stomach twisted. Anne tugged my sleeve. "He's going to the basement." My gaze followed hers. The man, or whatever he was now moving toward the old storm doors that led to the basement. His gait was unnatural, his steps uneven, almost like he was limping. No, not limping, hunching, like he was struggling to stay upright. We didn't wait any longer. Anne grabbed her phone and dialed 911, whispering frantically into the receiver. I kept my eyes locked on the thing outside, my pulse hammering in my ears. "We need police," Anne was saying. "There's someone outside my house. He's trying to get into our basement." The dispatcher asked her questions, but I barely heard. My attention was glued to the figure outside. Then the sirens. Faint at first, then growing louder, cutting through the quiet night like a blade. The man's head snapped up. He went rigid for a second. Then he dropped to all fours. My breath caught in my throat. He moved, no, he scuttled across the yard, his limbs bending in ways that didn't make sense. His long coat flared out behind him, and for the briefest moment I saw something. Something long. Something thin and covered in bristling fur. A tail. Anne sucked in a breath beside me. And then it was gone. It bolted toward the woods, disappearing into the darkness just as the police car pulled up. We barely managed to explain what we saw. The officers searched the property, shining flashlights into the trees, but they found nothing. "A homeless man, probably," one of them said, though his voice lacked conviction. Neither Anne nor I argued. We didn't know what we saw. We still don't. But when we finally crawled into bed that night, neither of us could sleep. We lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening for the sound of something moving outside, something that shouldn't exist. And that, my dear listeners, brings us to the end of tonight's episode. I hope these stories sent shivers down your spine and made you think twice about being home alone. If you enjoyed these tales of terror, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel for more spine-chilling stories. Until next time, sleep well, if you can.